Thanks, Greg. Look, I understand you're pressed for time, so I'll try and keep it brief. So I come at this very much from the overconsumption side of the problem, and I want to just mention a few, I guess, sort of practical approaches that might work. But before coming to that, just a couple of, I think, key background points that I think are worth highlighting. The first is that I think we'd all agree people don't choose to avoid food and become malnourished. And people they're not sloths and gluttons, and they don't choose to become obese. They really are far more than they would like to imagine products of their environment. We like to think we're free-living individuals making our own choices, but I think we're all somewhat deluded in that regard. Now, that's really important when it comes to thinking about how we're going to change the problems of malnutrition, whether they're the problems of underconsumption or overconsumption, because it suggests rather limited potential for interventions that are based around getting individuals to change their choices or educating individuals to try and get them to do that. Mostly it's going to be about politics, economics, and commerce. And I think that's particularly true these days where we're seeing massive globalization and industrialization of the food supply. Most countries have already experienced or are already experiencing a shift away from the consumption of foods prepared at home towards diets that are based increasingly upon consumer packaged goods and meals eaten outside of the home. And there's frankly, there are outposts, but in general, there's little evidence that the people with the power to control that, and there I mean governments, are actually willing or able to make the sorts of changes to substantively influence that pattern. So what are some of the practical things that we could do to protect communities better from the generally adverse changes, certainly from an overconsumption side of the problem, that are happening in terms of malnutrition? So I think the first thing is we need better global coordination of this. I mean, for me, it's actually incredibly refreshing to sit here and hear groups that I thought were primarily interested in sort of just the malnutrition side talking really clearly and really informatively about the overconsumption side of the problem and the need to bring the two together. So that's really encouraging, but I don't think that's actually happening out there in the real world in terms of trying to get things done in general. So I think there's an enormous opportunity there. I think we have to change the mantra of personal responsibility for dietary choices, because ultimately it's the environment that really matters, and the longer that we persist with this idea that we can educate people and we can get people to do the right thing, the longer we're going to have the problem and the bigger the problem is going to be. I think we also need to recognize that mostly governments aren't going to regulate and they're not going to pass taxes. I mean, there are examples where they've done, and we'll hear from one in a minute, I'm sure, but mostly they're not going to do that. And that has really important implications for what are we going to need to do to try and make things happen. And one of the areas that I'm particularly interested in is this sort of idea of trying to bring transparency and accountability to hold governments to account and to hold the food industry to account, because we hear, certainly in the areas that I work in, lots from government about, oh, how we're going to implement this policy, we're going to get food reformulation going. We hear from the food industry about how they're going to make all these changes and they're going to reduce sugars and reduce fats. But because all of these are voluntary, and there's no risk if you don't do them, they generate a great feeling for a year or two, or a month or two, or a week or two, but then they drift away and nothing really happens because there's no sanction if they don't happen. So what we've been trying to do, a big part of the work of our group, has been just to try to collect data at a massive scale about what is out there in the packaged food supply, to collect it in a standardized way, year on year, across jurisdictions, and start to be able to actually measure what is happening. If these companies or governments have actually said, we are going to improve this, then perhaps we can provide some data that, can one, help them plan better about how they might do it, but can also have that sort of stick piece to it and go, well, look, it's 2 years on now, this is what we see, and it hasn't happened. Or if it has happened, let's be really encouraging and positive and go, look, it's happened here, it hasn't happened there. Why is that? Maybe we can understand something about it. So it's trying to bring a different way of thinking about it, or trying to bring a way of thinking about it that will enable these public-private partnerships, these voluntary mechanisms to actually have some impact. So if we look at a few sort of specific opportunities, well, no, sorry, before I move to that. So the other option is to find dualities of interest. So where are the opportunities where we don't have to have a regulation because the business can actually make money out of it and we can get the public health gain? Now, I come from the clinical space where I've done a lot of work with the pharmaceutical industry, and it's very easy there because ultimately these companies are about developing and selling drugs which are intended to improve human health. I mean, there's lots of issues about just how that happens and how equitably it happens, but ultimately the goals are aligned. It's much harder to find those opportunities in the food space because, the model really is take low quality product, add lots of salt, sugar, fat, make it high palatable, give it a long shelf life, package it up, big portion sizes, sell it everywhere all the time. That's the way to make money as a food company. And it's clearly not going to achieve much from public health. But there are opportunities. And so, for example, we heard a bit about labeling. Labeling can be a negative to the food industry because it can highlight adverse things, but it can also be a positive if it's framed in the right way. If it's a labeling system that not only highlights the negatives, but also highlights the positives. That can encourage some components of the food industry, and it can encourage reformulation in a positive way. Food retailers, the big supermarkets, are quite an interesting space because they're somewhat agnostic about what they actually put on the shelves, because they can fill their shelves with a huge range of products, and if they wanted to, they could select people to put those things on the shelf who sell healthier things. And they also have a really strong interest in their own brand products. And we're seeing many examples around the world of retailers wanting to improve the healthiness of their own brand products and market their own brand products on the basis of healthiness, not just price. Health insurers. There's some really interesting examples of how health insurers are teaming up with food retailers and looking at really innovative ways of getting the lives they have insured to buy healthier, which not only increases the market for healthier foods, but also improves the profitability of the insurers because they don't have to pay out as much. Salt substitution. Salt substitutes are potentially a really promising way to reduce blood pressure, and they're about twice as expensive as regular salt. They're still incredibly cheap, but there's an economic case there for getting salt manufacturers potentially to shift to selling salt substitutes. We'll hear more about some of the opportunities that perhaps don't have quite that same duality of interest, advertising controls and fiscal interventions from our next speaker. And I'll stop there and pass on.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for that.